Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar that we've done for the public on all of our research. I wanted it initially to be targeted to the non-dual community because the non-dual community really was one of the earliest communities to open their homes and open their hearts to our research project, and it was really such a tremendous honor to be able to find such help so early on when we were really just struggling to get our feet under us and trying to come to grips with whether or not it was even possible to look into something that we came later to call persistent non-symbolic experience, but which, of course, is known by a lot of other names. So mystical experience is probably the most common name that it's known by. However, we're talking about a persistent form of it, not a temporary form of it. So really it's things like enlightenment, non-duality, persistent mystical experience, union with God or union with the divine or union with nature, transcendental consciousness. In fact, we've cataloged over the years well over a couple of hundred different ways that this is referred to worldwide. Tonight we're essentially going to cover four main topics. And these are the topics that really lie at the absolute heart of all of our research. So the first topic that we're going to take a look at is the primary finding from all of those 8+ years that we spent in the field researching. And of course we're still researching, but we've made tremendous progress. And for many years we've been describing something that we call the persistent non-symbolic experience continuum. It turns out that there isn't just one non-duality or one enlightenment or one persistent mystical state. There's a wide range of these things, and there's a number of different ways that they show up. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is that part of the research, and really that sort of key finding that helps you orient and really helps you to make sense out of a lot of what you see out there from a public standpoint. We're also going to talk about the two biggest findings that we had for what actually produces this in people. Now, it's very important to note that not everyone is seeking this. We had well over 1,000 official research subjects, and although we tried to get strong and solid representative samples across different religions and across different spiritual systems and things like that, ultimately there were also a lot of people who had come to this out of the depths of depression. They weren't looking for it. They weren't seeking it. It was just something that came on them. So, they were just so deeply suicidally depressed, and then one day the skies parted and their well-being was, extraordinary compared to really anything that they'd experienced previously. Also, some people just have it happen to them out of the blue. So we've cataloged a lot of that as well. In this particular webinar, though, we're going to focus on a couple of findings that help you if you're trying to get there, or if you think that you're, partially persistent, but maybe in and out of it, or maybe you've had glimpses of it a long, long time ago. We've got some really cool research findings from the last year or so that have explored this. We've been trying for the first time for the last year or so to actually see if all of our data and all of this descriptive data and all of the neuroscience data and all this stuff that we've been accumulating can actually be applied to help people get there. And those particular experiments have been going incredibly well. So we're going to take a look at that tonight. We're also going to take a look at what has emerged from that research with trying to get people there, which is that sometimes people are already there and they just don't know it. Or there's sort of a confusion around whether or not something is persistent or a temporary version of the experience. That's been a neat finding for us to see because, of course, for all those years we only sat down with people who claimed persistence, and really persistence for quite a while. So we weren't aware really of the confusion that could happen out there until we were doing these experiments over the last year or so, trying to actually get people there and then tracking that progress and collecting a lot of data on their path. So those are the three primary things that we're going to cover. We're also going to take a look at some integration of all of those things. So really the different types of persistent non-symbolic experience and best practices for each one of those types. We really feel that there's only 4 primary types, and as I mentioned earlier, we place these on a continuum of experience, meaning that it's not punctuated, that dramatically. In other words, sort of one fades into the next, fades into the next, fades into the next. It's kind of a gradient, if you will. But nonetheless, there are 4 regions on that continuum, or what we call them as locations. So there's 4 locations on that continuum that virtually everyone seems to fall into. Every now and then we run across a research subject that's gone further than these 4 locations, but generally speaking, 99% probably, at least 98, 97% of the people that we've talked to, they fall into one of these 4 locations. All right, so those are our topics essentially, and they represent absolutely the coolest findings that we've produced over the course of this research. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that we've presented this a lot in the academic world. If you know anything about our research project, you know that our center has really been instrumental in networking people together in academia and kind of getting these projects and getting people interested in this and providing them political cover, because as you can imagine, this is not the easiest thing to say that you're going to be researching if you're a professor somewhere at a major university. So we've worked really hard on this education process in the academic world for years now, but really we haven't had that much exposure to the public, and now we just really feel that it's time to be able to get that information out there. So there's a book draft that's in final edit that we've been working on for years that'll come out soon. There's talks that we have given over time. I've spoken at TEDx events and occasionally at things like Deepak Chopra's events and things like that, places that did allow for some interaction with the public. But this is, I think, really the first time that it's going to be an in-depth presentation of some of the absolute neatest and most useful stuff from our research to what I hope is a very interested crowd out there. Again, originally this was supposed to be just non-dual folks, but word seems to have kind of spread. I was looking at the attendee list, and there's a lot of friends, research participants from the non-dual community and beyond, other researchers, lots of people I don't know, etc. on the list. So I'm going to keep it pretty targeted to the original webinar that we had in mind, but I'm going to try to include a little bit more breadth for the rest of you as well. Okay, so let's start by actually giving you a little bit of background. And I'm going to move pretty quickly through this background because I think you're probably mostly interested in what's in it for you, rather than understanding all the intricacies of what happened, over the course of the project and things like that. So I'm going to see if I can get a little screen share going on here. And what I'm going to do is pull up a presentation that I did earlier this year for an academic gathering of consciousness folks. So this isn't going to be too fancy. It's just going to be some PowerPoint slides. But I'd like you to have something to look at other than me as we go through this. So let me back up here. You can see I was kind of getting it ready. Sorry, we sort of jumped ahead here to the experiment. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about our approach over the years. We started by giving people what are called gold standard self-report measures. So these are things like academic measures that determine how much well-being or happiness someone has, where their depression's at, their anxiety, things like that. The project really started by giving people who purported some type of persistent non-symbolic experience, whether it was non-duality or whatever, these types of measures. Frankly, that didn't show very much except for what the people said in the first place, which is that they had high well-being and that they weren't depressed, etc. So there wasn't any really interesting findings from that, and we moved on pretty quickly to in-depth interviews. So some of you on the call probably remember me sitting in your living room for hours at a time asking you questions. That's the in-depth interview phase of this project, and it was very often 6 to 12 hours. I would often joke that I would stay in someone's living room until they kicked me out, or we would sort of chase from a restaurant to a coffee shop, and then when one coffee shop closed, maybe another coffee shop if I couldn't go to their house for some reason because they had kids or something like that and they didn't want to keep them up. These in-depth interviews wound up being the real magic behind the project, because they focused our questions on areas that we thought would eventually be helpful for things like fMRI and EEG and essentially neurological scanning and measurement. So we focused on cognition, affect, memory, and perception. So I would ask you questions about how your thoughts or the nature of your thoughts changed, how your emotions changed, how your memory had changed, how your perception had changed from before persistent non-symbolic experience or non-duality to after it. And then we would sort of correlate all of that information. And we would also look for testable psychological claims along the way. For instance, sometimes people would say, well, you know, I don't feel like I could possibly be racist or sexist anymore, or that part of me, you know, has gone away. And we would use well-known research projects, like, for instance, for that one, we would use Project Implicit at Harvard University to test whether or not that seemed to actually be the case. So we were doing interviews, we were doing experiments. You can see down there we eventually moved on to physiological measurement. Some of that we did very early on, but oftentimes we did it later on. All of like the EEG, fMRI stuff, that was all coordinating with other neuroscience researchers later on. We had a lot of participants. I picked some pictures here from some people that I saw signed up and might be on the call. So if any of these faces look familiar, they're some of the best public teachers out there. However, I also want to note that they weren't just public teachers. We worked very hard to get beyond the people who were in some way teaching this or doing this professionally. And we tried to get beyond that as rapidly as we possibly could and just get to normal people, people who were, you know, a programmer in the middle of nowhere, in the middle part of the country, working from home, for instance, or a small business owner in New Jersey, you know, something like that. So the vast majority of our participants were actually ordinary people, and they really spanned all of humanity. So they were everything from super achievers, people who ran huge multinational corporations, things like that, to people who were basically broke and homeless. They were mostly religious or spiritual, but they had often lost their religion or their spirituality as a result of this transition to persistent non-symbolic experience. One of the things that's interesting about it is that how it lands for you can be very contextual. So if you're in church, for instance, and you know, sort of the Spirit of the Lord comes upon you or something like that from a Christian perspective, well, you may very well remain a very strong, sort of religiously oriented, persistent, non-symbolic person after that. However, you might be religious and have it come on you in a park, you know, looking out at a beautiful lake, and that might actually shift you away from your religion and from your previous belief system. They spanned a huge age range. So they're from their late teens. Our approval for research at various institutions essentially began at age 18. So that was our early cutoff, all the way into their mid-90s. They were globally dispersed, though we only did English speakers officially. They were generally educated. They were generally college educated. The sample was skewed towards men. It ran about 65% men, and we tried really, really hard to skew that the other way. There were a few times where we brought in some female researchers just specifically to try to, and gave them the task of trying to skew the sample as best they could in the other direction, and it always came up with the same percentage. So I don't know what that means, but I think it's kind of an interesting finding. And there were various races, but essentially it was skewed towards Caucasians. Okay, so let me get on to the first thing that we want to talk about, which is this idea of a continuum. So here we have the 4 primary locations on the continuum. Now they actually represent regions. So there's a lot of sort of sub but very related types of persistent non-symbolic experience or non-duality that can show up within each one of these locations. So you might think of them as sub-locations within each one of these. They're basically grouped for convenience. Remember, this is a continuum. However, they really are very much, you know, the experiences in each one of these locations is very strongly related to the other experiences that we've grouped together. So even though it is a gradient, nonetheless, there are these very highly related things that sort of group along it. And generally, when people do move along the continuum, so let's say that you have your initial awakening experience from a non-dual standpoint, maybe in location 2, You may deepen into location 2, which means that your experience of location 2 may root itself in more and more strongly over time, or you may have a transition to another location, and when you have a transition, it's generally going to be towards a later location. Let me just talk a little bit about each one of these. So all of them have something in common, and that is a fundamental shift in sense of self, a fundamental shift in what it's like, what it feels like to be you. And you often, if you're familiar with the non-dual community, for example, you often hear this show up with things, with phrases like, there is no me anymore. So that's a very common way of hearing it. Well, for each of these locations, that could be true, and someone might purport that there's a feeling that there's no them anymore. But how that no them shows up actually differs between each one of these locations. So earlier I said that there's differences between thoughts and thinking, cognition, emotions, affect, perception and memory. Let's talk a little bit about some of those differences between these locations. So let's say that you have an awakening experience and you show up in location 1. You're going to feel an expansion of your sense of self. It may feel like a connection to the divine if you're spiritual or religious in some way, or it may feel like a connection to nature if you're an atheist or an agnostic or something. And that shows the different flavors, really, that accompany this. And those flavors are seen in a lot of detail in our research throughout all of these different aspects of it. We're only going to be able to touch on a few of them tonight. You're much less affected by self-referential thoughts, by what we call narrative thoughts. So the stories in your head, essentially. Hang on a second here. Hello? The slides are stuck. Oh, okay. A little call from somebody who actually was watching that I knew. And they said that the slides are stuck. So I'll tell you what. It doesn't really matter to me. Well, I'll just say stop sharing. And we'll just go back to me, I suppose. And we'll look at me here. And that's no big deal, because obviously I've presented this a million times, and I know it all off the top of my head, forward and backwards. All right, so in location 1, these self-referential thoughts, essentially, it can feel like they've all gone away. So people will say things like, all of the thoughts in my head went away. But when we really dig in with individuals that are experiencing this, that's not completely true, right? I mean, if I say, well, what's 1 + 1? And they'll say 2, right? So, okay, well, wasn't that a thought in your head? Oh, well, yeah, I didn't mean those types of thoughts. So it's really a certain type of thought. It's a self-referential type of thought that goes away. It's that narrative thought that's in your head. It's that voice in your head, if you will, that is, constantly chattering on about this or that, talking about this or that. That's the type of thought that is reduced, or even at some points on the continuum, actually eliminated. So big change in thoughts. Now that doesn't mean that, especially in these earlier locations on the continuum, that people spend their entire day completely free of those narrative thoughts. And I think that that's one of the points of confusion that we've seen a lot in the different communities worldwide. When you have this reduction in self-referential thought, that certainly doesn't mean that they can't come back from time to time, even from time to time over the course of the day. But they come back in kind of a different way. They're not as sticky. If they drag you on with some narrative story about this or that, you're much more likely to have that narrative fall away the minute you notice it. Rather than becoming involved in it and being totally sucked into it and, oh yeah, she did say that about whatever, and oh, I totally disagree with that, and, all of that type of tense sort of narrative thought that most people are used to. Not the case for persistent non-symbolic experience. And as you might imagine, that produces a tremendous amount of relief. Also produces a feeling of a lot of spaciousness and things like that. So some of those other terms that you're familiar with from a non-dual standpoint, or whatever your tradition is, if you're watching this from outside that, there's this sense of spaciousness that people often talk about, things like that. Well, as you might imagine, there's a lot more space if there isn't this constant chatter rolling around in your head. Similar thing with emotions. You have negative emotions, especially in location 1, falling off much more rapidly. It doesn't mean that you don't have negative emotions. You certainly have a balance of positive and negative emotions. And that's one of the things that changes as you move further down the continuum. So just to keep an eye on time and try to get through as much of this as we can, let's jump ahead. We'll leave memory and perception aside for now. Let's jump ahead to location 2 and what that would look like. Essentially, you have a continuing reduction in those self-referential thoughts and those narrative thoughts. So what thoughts remained in location 1 have continued to lessen in location 2. You're usually seeing a reduction in negative emotionality as you move through and deepen into location 2. So it becomes an increasingly positive experience for you. And towards the end, if you will, of location 2, if you want to think of it in terms of a linear left-right from location 1 to location 3, or I think of it as deepening essentially into location 2. Sort of the further you move along towards location 3, the deeper you're going into location 2. So the deeper you go into location 2, towards the end of it, it might be extraordinarily unusual for you to even have a negative thought, or not a negative thought, but a negative emotion. So maybe 2 or 3 times a year there's a negative emotion. And that really precipitates the change that happens with location 3, which is, I think, a pretty well-known location out there. This is a location that is talked about a lot in certain religious and spiritual traditions especially. This is really, one might consider this the end of the Christian path, the traditional Christian path, for instance, where you're in this intense sort of unitive experience. In their case, it would be union with the divine, or Jesus, or Christ, or God, or whatever their sect dictates that union should be with. There's a sense of this intense union with that, which showing up emotionally at this point is a single emotion essentially in the background. And that's an emotion that feels like a combination of things like love and joy, compassion, things like that. So there's these different facets of this emotion, and one of the facets or a couple of the facets can be stronger at any given time, but it still feels like it's part of this overall whole within this emotion. Okay, so big change with location 3, as you might imagine, a continued reduction in self-referential thoughts and narrative thoughts. At this point, they're almost gone. It's pretty rare to still sort of be having them pop up and drag you in. The things that will still pop up and drag you in at location 3 are the really deep stuff. So family stuff, you go home and if you're a young person, maybe you go home and you visit mom, and mom is just pushing all the right buttons that she programmed in over all those years that she had you, and that just flares it up. But the flare-up is quick, often instantaneous, and will pass by very rapidly. So it's those types of changes that you see from location 1 to 2 to 3 in a very quick nutshell on only a couple of points, but just to orient you in some way, just to give you sort of a flavor of these. Now location 4 is almost its own thing. It's totally different than everything that came before it. And I think people are very, very shocked by it. In fact, if we were to continue sort of the Christian example, Bernadette Roberts is a good example of someone who's in location 4. She worked the Christian path all the way to maximum union, all the way to the end of 3, and then she fell right off the end of her Christian path. And she was looking around in all of the books and trying to find anything that related to her new experience, and she couldn't find anything, which is why she wrote about it. But in those books, you can really see her struggle with trying to contextualize it. It's a place where emotion falls away. It's a place where a sense of the divine falls away. So if you can imagine being her and having this intense union experience and then having that just disappear in an instant, and what that must be like, especially since your worldview basically says you want the unit of experience, that's the goal. If now, from a non-dual standpoint, oftentimes there's not a lot of union with God or that type of thing so much in the non-dual community. It's often sort of a panpsychist notion, and that simply is a term that means it feels like everything is conscious, or at least everything is made out of consciousness, so that there's just sort of this field of consciousness, if you will. That also transitions at location 4. So the sense of divinity falls away for a religious or a spiritual person, but the sense of everything, sort of this all-pervasive, everything being conscious, falls away in the transition to location 4 on the non-religious, sort of non-spiritual side. So if an atheist was working their way through to 4, for instance, to choose an extreme example, that's how it would show up for them. Self-referential thoughts are essentially gone at this point. So location 4, really, no emotion, no sense of agency, no self-referential thought. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't feelings that show up. It's not that anger can't show up. And this is a really sort of complex topic. When I say no emotion, don't necessarily let that terrify you too much. There are some basic feelings that all of us have built into us. Interestingly, love does not seem to be one of them. It's unheard of, really, for me to sit down with someone in location 4 who says that they're capable of the emotion of love, or that they feel the emotion of love. But there are some that seem like very low-level, baseline, hardwired in feelings that can still show up. But of course, there's no identification with them at all. They're not in any way personalized or whatever. They just kind of come and go as quick flashes from here, here and there for people. Okay, so you're probably thinking to yourself, oh, what's beyond 4? Right? I always get that. So I'm just going to very briefly say that a couple of things happen at location 4. Actually, 3 different things. Some people stay there, which is absolutely fine. Some people get there and they're like, this isn't the experience that I necessarily want to have, and they try to pull themselves back to an earlier location on the continuum, and it's actually not that hard to do. So there are plenty of people that have done that. And some people, especially if they're in a tradition that guides them this way, and there are some traditions that do this. Tibetan Buddhism is a good example of a tradition that has knowledge of this. Some people go further. From a non-duality standpoint, I actually think some of the things that John Wheeler talks about in terms of his reinterpretation, or at least his interpretation, his specific interpretation of Nisargadatta's material, sounds a lot like it's the stage or 2 beyond location 4 to me, whether we want to call those 5 or 6. Or whatever. So I do actually think that it shows up in the traditional Neo-Advaita, if you will, sort of non-dual type of literature. So it shows up there. It shows up in Tibetan Buddhism. It shows up in a few places, but knowledge of it is pretty rare. It's very unusual for us to run across people, really, that have gone beyond 4. So 4 seems to be sort of a staging ground that you can do a lot of stuff with. You can either move ahead with it, or you can stay there, or you can move back to an earlier location from there. All right, so now that you're oriented, that's one of the huge findings, are these different buckets. And it really doesn't matter if I'm sitting down with a Christian or a Sufi from Islam or a Tibetan Buddhist or someone from the non-dual community or whatever. Their experiences seem very well encapsulated in these. Now, remember that these are not hard boundaries, right? So there are transitional stages, and there's sort of a phasing in to location 4, for instance, from location 3. If you're moving from location 3 to location 4, you may have some of the elements of location 3 still, some of the elements of location 4 sort of being mixed in there. It's not like it's necessarily just the switch that flips, and then all of a sudden, it's completely different. So people can sometimes just kind of reside in those boundary areas, and then they kind of have a unique mix of both of those things. All right, so now that you're oriented, that's the absolute baseline stuff. Let me talk about point number 2, which is, I think, one of the things that a lot of you are going to be interested in that are listening to this. And point number 2 is, what are our 2 big findings? What were essentially the 2 secrets, if you will, that we uncovered that seem to actually help people reach non-duality, seem to help people reach persistent non-symbolic experience? I don't think that you could have come across this data and these 2 points without really doing a study that was as large and as wide-ranging as ours. I think you really needed the cross-cultural data. You needed to talk to a lot of people from a lot of traditions that had it happen to them a lot of ways in order to kind of see this pattern emerge clearly. And we'll talk about that quite a bit here. It's just we'll probably spend the most time on this and then a little bit of time on the last 2 points, and then I hope that we have some time to get to your questions, because I always look forward to questions. Okay, so point number 1. One of the things that emerged from our research data is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of very effective methods for moving people along. And in fact, we think realistically 6 categories or 6 families of methods are enough. So if you were to search Google right now, right, and maybe you're doing that in another window as this is playing in the background since there aren't PowerPoint slides to look at, right, and you're just kind of stuck looking at me at this point. If you were to search Google and you were to search it for meditation, or you were to search it for non-duality, or you were to search it for whatever you're interested in, you'd find zillions of things that come up. Lots of stuff that people swear works. It was a huge surprise for us when we sorted the data to realize that the question that we asked people, which was usually asked on a participant forum for most of the research, it was earlier on sort of asked in person. What is it that sorts the top of the list for you? What is the thing that was really effective? What rang the bell for you? When people could say what it was, it turns out that it was really one of a handful of different things. So secret number one essentially is that you've got to somehow luck your way into one of those methods out of that huge sea of stuff that's out there online and at different centers or whatever. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to actually match the thing to you. So it's not enough for, even if I were to just give you a list of the 6 things, right? It's not enough for you to just have a list of these 6 things, because 5 of them may work for you not at all. And maybe 2 of them will take you in the opposite direction. One interesting finding from the current research project was I was looking at week-to-week tracking in the research experiments where we're basically taking people and using these methods and some other stuff and trying to wake them up. And this one method was, this one person had been in a persistent form of non-symbolic experience for a while, and then that next method that we were introducing to the program just rapidly pulled them back out of it, right? So it seems like you can be in phase and out of phase with these methods. They can, at best, do nothing for you, really, right? At worst, they might actually take you in the wrong direction and have negative consequences for you if you're trying to get to non-duality or persistent non-symbolic experience. And only if you're like extremely lucky have you found a method that not only works for you, but the method that's actually matched with you. So these 2 elements are the most important things, I think, for you to keep in mind. And if we want to make this sort of a story from the research, a good way to think about it is, if you came to me as a research participant, I was probably going to hear one of a few things from you. Now, I'm assuming that you didn't wake up from depression, or you didn't just you weren't working in like your field or something, and you bent over to pick something up, and it just happened to you. And certainly, we've collected plenty of that data as well. So I'm talking about the people who are doggedly pursuing this. So if you were pursuing this in some way, one of the things that may have happened to you is you went online, or you asked a friend, or whatever. Somehow you found and you decided upon the first method that you were going to try. One of a few things probably happened to you. First, you might have gotten incredibly lucky. And if you did, then you would probably have reported to us that you woke up pretty quickly. Could have been even as short as days, weeks, certainly months would have been common for that type of report. Maybe an early number of years if there was something else sort of going on there. But generally speaking, you would have reported to us that you woke up pretty quickly. Now, maybe you tried that first method, and that first method didn't work for you. And instead of trying a different method and seeing if something else might work for you, perhaps that method had a little lore that went along with it that you bought into. So perhaps that method, the people who were teaching that method said something like, this is the one path, right? This is the only way that you are going to get there. And you believed them because you hadn't looked around a lot or whatever. They seemed credible. You wanted to believe them. Whatever reason, you believed them. And so you just kind of kept at it, right? And you just went with that method day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and probably by the time you got to our study, if it wasn't at least a number of years, number of decades. That was not at all uncommon. And so what we personally wonder about, and we're trying to think of ways to test this, what we personally wonder about is, do some people eventually come into alignment with the method? So even though when they start practicing it, they're not aligned with it necessarily, do they eventually come into alignment with it? Maybe it takes them 7 years to do it. Maybe it takes them 27 years to do it. But at some point, there is a match eventually between them and that method, and then it starts working for them. That's just a hypothesis. We're trying to figure out how we can test that. People on those paths often have all kinds of stories about how it worked really quick for Jane, and Pete still hasn't worked for Pete, and he's been at it as long as I have. Right? So there's this wide variance that we see that, again, sort of seems to lend some credibility to this idea of matching up. The third possibility, of course, is that you switched methods. Maybe even if they said, hey, listen, this is the only true way, whatever you do, don't look in another direction. You thought to yourself, well, phooey on you, and you went out and you started looking around. You tried another thing, another 10 things, another 100 things. Some people have tried just astonishing amount of stuff over decades of trying to get to persistent non-symbolic experience before they reach it, and somehow fell into our study. So what you're most likely to report to us, if that's the case, is that you eventually found something that worked for you, and when you found something that worked for you, your progress was pretty rapid, just as if you'd had found it first. So that's where we really got this idea of this matching process. Obviously, we got the brilliant notion that there were only a handful of things, sort of these categories, that seemed to work for larger percentages of people, simply because that's what people were reporting had worked for them, right? So that wasn't exactly some sort of stroke of analytical genius on our part. But the second part of matching, it did actually take some teasing out of the data, and we were a little bit weary of it at first. So one of the things that we started doing about a year ago was trying to determine if we could actually test that theory. We knew we had this list of methods, if we want to call them sort of the best practices to choose from, and we started working people through them. So initially, you sort of don't know what's going to happen, right? So you just kind of do it with people who are around. Frankly, it might be like a research assistant or, whoever's kind of around the project. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, could we just cycle people through these? Was it just simply that if we were to give you a list of those 6 things and you just did them all for a month or 3 months or however long each, would that work for you? Would you eventually find something that worked for you? Or, how could we really take this data and test this notion that it wasn't just about this collection of things, but that it also had to be matched to you? And we looked at different religions and stuff like that. One of the interesting things is that some of these do go across all religions. For instance, one of the things that, or at least most religions, one of the things that sorted to the top was mantra-based practice. Now, there's a lot of nuances in mantra practice, and we don't have time to talk about all of that and which ones might be more or less effective or any of that. But let's just say mantra practice in general for now, right? And if you think about it, mantra practice kind of goes across a huge number of religions. It goes across a lot of spiritual systems. It goes across to even psychologies. Herb Benson, for instance, at Harvard Medical School, popularized a kind of agnostic mantra-based meditation program and researched the heck out of it for things like stress and stuff like that. And so here's a very widely distributed practice, and it's a practice that rose to the top of the list. However, other practices, they're not found in the vast majority of religious or spiritual systems out there, right? So you're a little bit out of luck if you wind up being in one of those religions or one of those spiritual systems that doesn't have a method that's matched to you. A certain percentage of people are going to be getting to some sort of non-duality or mystical experience or enlightenment or whatever the religion or spiritual system calls it, but a good chunk of people aren't, because it's just kind of a missing cog in the wheel, if you will. And I think these traditions that have really sort of scratched their heads over this and struggled with it and invented all kinds of reasons for why this might be the case for so many years, I suspect personally that this finding would be very relevant to them, and that if they could just find a way to pull in a few other practices and kind of give a rounded panoply of things to their adherents, they'd see a totally different ballgame, and that probably people would still wake up within the context of those beliefs and those ideologies and things like that. In other words, it wouldn't feel like everything was conscious. It would feel like the divine, for instance. So we're interested in testing that, and we're working on some ways to test that moving forward. But in the meantime, we thought to ourselves, well, let's just do it in the lab. So we started last year, and we started messing around with these methods, essentially, these best practices methods that sorted to the top of the list. What we wound up discovering is that there seemed to be sort of a safety range with some of them. And you could pretty much, after a week of practicing any of these, tell if they were something that was going to head in the right direction for you. Now, I don't mean like a 5-minute practice of these things, but if you were to do, one of these, for instance, so let's say you were to do a certain type of mantra practice, and you were to do that for an hour a day for a full week. Really, by the end of that week, people have a good idea of whether or not they're aligned with that or they're not aligned with it. And so that was another great finding for us, is that it didn't turn out to be something where like people had to practice it for a year and we were going to have these ridiculously long research cycles and stuff like that. So we narrowed down this week finding, which is I think another useful thing for any of you that are trying to find sort of your own practices that work and whatnot to keep in mind. An hour a day at least, got to get to at least an hour. The more the better, right? But got to get to at least an hour a day. Shorter than that, and the effect seems to fall off, and for at least a solid week. Okay, so what else did we learn? Well, we learned that it helped to put these in a certain order, which was interesting. And so we did actually wind up with an order that people went through them, sort of to get optimal results, to sort of loosen the lid on their jar, if you will. However, that doesn't mean that, that people weren't having experiences or weren't getting effects or whatever until the end of the last practice, the last day of the last week of the 6th practice or something like that. Another quite big surprise was that people could move quite quickly. People could have quite rapid shifts. And of course, we'd seen this in the research, but it was definitely in a minority of participants who seemed to be the ones that sort of got lucky finding the right match. So we were seeing that for the first time, really, in our experiential data. Well, let's keep this moving. We don't have a lot of time tonight, so let me jump ahead. Earlier this year, I know that there are some people that are listening to this from one or both of these experiments. Earlier this year, we basically took it out into groups. So one of the things that we did was we wrote a book called The Fourth Awakening at some point in the research process. I don't remember, 2009 or something like that. And it was written basically to find mainstream research subjects people who experienced persistent non-symbolic experience, but who were just, like mechanics working in a garage somewhere, or office people somewhere, or whatever else. We wanted them to contact us. We wanted them to find out about us, to know about us, and to contact us. And so we wrote this book called The Fourth Awakening, which wound up becoming pretty popular. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and whatnot. And we built people would sign up for a mailing list for it. And so we built a small mailing list, maybe like 5 or something thousand people. But that mailing list was really useful when we wanted to recruit sort of normal people, if you will, that had an interest in awakening, that had an interest in non-duality, that had an interest in persistent non-symbolic experience. And so we recruited people from these types of mailing lists, sort of that we built up from limited public interactions and whatnot over time for the first group experiment of this earlier this year. And we picked 6 people. I picked 6 people because there was no telling what was going to happen. We were on virgin ground. And I did not want a situation where people had adverse psychological impacts that we were not able to handle professionally. So I thought 6 people is a reasonable number that even if everybody wigs out at the same time or something, we easily have enough support that we can provide for those people. 5 people successfully completed that program, and all 5 of those people transitioned to a persistent form of non-symbolic experience. One basically around a couple at the end of location 1, a couple in location one in location 2, one in location 3, one in location 4, something like that. And now I've looked at so much data from the second run of this that it's getting hard for me to remember that without the PowerPoint. That would have been a convenient thing for that PowerPoint. Okay, so we then ran a second one. Now, keep in mind, we were not planning on people waking up in this class, right? I mean, we put it out as an online class, but it was an experiment, and we really were expecting to be collecting data for years from these folks, right? I mean, my thought was kind of, you know, maybe after a year or two, one of these people will have some sort of deeper fundamental shift, and that'll be great because we'll have all of this data that we collected before it for the first time. We'll have data from before it. Well, there's no real data in our world on people before and after. This is a big deal for us. This is why we're doing it initially, trying to get that A-B data that we would call it, before and after data. But it turned out that actually over the course of the class, 4 people woke up during the course of the class, and a couple, like the last couple, woke up not long after it, including the 6th person who kind of didn't finish it successfully and who disappeared there for a while on us. And that person has been kind of in and out of it since then. But those 5 people that did successfully complete it, they seem to be holding their ground. And in fact, they were very, very helpful when we went to run the second one because they could be mentors who had been through the class and all of that. So we then ran a second experiment, which was 60 people. We thought, well, it seems, you know, reasonably safe, and we can tighten parameters, and we had a good handle on it, we thought, at that point. And so we thought we can take in maybe 10 times as many people. And so we decided to stick with these people. Formed a really tight group of 6 people. So we thought, okay, well, we'll keep stuff as much the same as we possibly can, and we'll put together these groups of 6 people, and so we'll do 10 groups of 6 people. And so those 10 groups of 6 people basically have, I think, 1 week left, a week and a half or something left at this point in their course/experiment. And already the data shows that over half of them are experiencing sort of a persistent form of this. So they're across the continuum, just like before. We've had reports of everything from 1 to 4. And we've also administered, you know, a very wide range of psychological measures with this. So well-being, depression, stress, anxiety, even things like sick days and physical health. Lots of psychological terms that you would have never heard of before, so no need to mention those. Mystical experience, some scales on mystical experience and things like that. And all of those were essentially in the same direction and really within the same magnitude or so at this point for both groups. And we're really looking forward to getting the last set of data from the end of this course. We take 3 measurements, beginning, middle, and end of those courses. So I got the beginning and middle for the second one, but we don't have the last one yet. We won't collect that for another couple of weeks or so. All right, so we kind of put this to the test, and it seemed to really validate, that's why I'm mentioning this, it seemed to really validate this notion of these 2 important points, right, which is 1, you've got to find at least a family of methods to explore around in that seem to work. And the second thing is that you need to find the one that's matched to you. It's not enough to just stay with something for, at least you can if you want to, but I don't recommend staying with something forever that doesn't work for you. You really can tell pretty quickly from what our data seems to suggest that, you know, whether or not something is sort of moving in your favor or not in relation to all of this. Okay, let me move on to the final couple of points here real quick. And they're going to be, I'm going to try to get to them as quick as I can here so that we can get to some questions before we wrap up. So the third point was that some people are non-dual and just don't know it. Now, of course, there's a lot of people out there who are non-dual who say everybody's non-dual and just doesn't know it. But I'm talking about, like, you know, realizing it within your ongoing experience of the world and that type of thing. So we discovered some really interesting stuff around this, and it's been fascinatingly informed by these 2 group experiments. Especially the second one, because the first one, because we didn't expect people to wake up during the experiment and during those initial 15 weeks or so, 6 methods, but there's some complexity, so it's a 15-week experiment essentially. Because we didn't expect it for the first one, we didn't collect that much, nearly the density of data that we could have, and we did definitely collect much more data off the second group. And in that second group, what we've seen is really interesting. So I think this could probably really help you to understand, where you're at, because I've seen a lot of people in our course / experiment struggling with it. So here's a couple of different ways to think about it. You might have had a powerful temporary experience that faded. Maslow's famous peak experiences that, it seems like everybody's heard of, because it's Maslow's theory is all over TV and all that. You really can't be in this. You can't be in the mystical space, the non-dual space, the whatever space, and not be familiar with this idea of peak experience, these mystical experiences that people have. Well, we had people in the experiment that had one of these, a long time ago, decades ago, in some cases, all the way on up to people that were having them with some degree of frequency, even right before the course, right before the experiment. So the first thing I think to realize is that not all temporary experiences are created equal. And Maslow did something. Maslow really sort of came to an interesting place just before he died in the early 70s. And fortunately for us, absolutely wonderful academic named Stanley Krippner, happened to be a young academic at the time, and he was on a panel with Maslow, and he heard Maslow talking about this, and Stan actually paid out of his own pocket to have this transcribed and put into an academic article. So we know what Maslow was thinking about this. Maslow reached a point where he was still talking about peak experiences, but then he started talking about plateau experiences, which are what we would refer to as persistent non-symbolic experience, and what you would probably refer to as non-duality in the context of this call. So Maslow, first of all, got there himself, and he was able to see the differences himself, but he was also obviously a keen researcher, so he was able to explore it a little bit. And one of the things that became incredibly clear from him, and it was so helpful to have his information to read because it really helped us to contextualize these experiences when students in the course, when participants in the course and whatnot started talking about this stuff. Because remember, we're experts in the persistent form of this, right? But we're definitely not experts in the temporary form of this. All of our 8 years of research have been with people who reported essentially at least a year of persistence. So one of the things that we've seen is, first of all, that not all temporary experiences are created equal. Now, the type of peak experiences that Maslow talks about and the mystical experiences that are sort of common to hear about, they often involve high arousal. So they often, they bring a rush of energy, which can also bring a rush of ecstasy and joy and bliss and all of these other things with it, right? They might bring a noetic sense, a sense that there's a deep truth that's being imparted, and certainly there's a few other things that they bring with them, but these are the important ones for differentiation. Certainly they really leave a profound impact on someone. They can absolutely produce a significant change in someone, and it's not at all surprising that people often that have them spend a lot of their life trying to get back to them. I've had endless numbers of people contact our research project over the years with that being their story, and until recently, until these very recent experiments, unfortunately, we've had to say, I have no idea. Now at least we have something that we can talk about on a webinar like this that might be able to help. Now, persistent non-symbolic experience, non-duality, however we want to think about it, it can often arrive with a peak-like experience. So it can often arrive with high arousal, with tremendous overwhelming bliss, and it can last for weeks or even longer in some cases, and then it tapers off, right? And people are like, oh, where'd it go? I want it back, right? And then the search and the struggle and whatever begins. What we've seen in the course is that some people have that pattern when they sort of initially shift into this. However, that doesn't mean that the experience of non-duality or persistent non-symbolic experience or whatever went away after that arousal wore off. So they're just like not noticing it, essentially, right? It's kind of fascinating. But if you think about it, if you have a day or a week or a couple of weeks or whatever, in this extreme bliss and whatever else, and then it tapers off into a deep and tranquil peace. those are two extremes, of course, but your calibration is kind of set to think, oh man, it's that bliss, it's that high arousal, that's where it's at. You know, that's what people are talking about when they're talking about these states and that you can be in for a long time. How do I get back to that? How do I lengthen that? And actually, in its wake, it's left them with a accessible and sort of easy to soak into and sink into and cement into, if you will, persistent form of non-duality or persistent non-symbolic experience. It's just that they're looking in completely the opposite direction because they think it's one thing when it's not. So from a persistent non-symbolic experience standpoint, certainly some people do have a persistent bliss state or whatever. It's a very certain part of the continuum, and it's very few people really that are there. For the vast majority of people, there are certain commonalities that it has. You know, there's a sense of fundamental well-being, if you will, that accompanies it. There's a decrease in the effect of emotionality. Emotional range can narrow, but it doesn't necessarily have to narrow. It can simply be that emotions fall off more rapidly, especially negative emotions. So there can be a skew towards positive emotion in some aspects of this, as opposed and away from negative emotions that for many people, you know, negative emotions often dominate for them. And so people will often assume that what they're experiencing after this is, after sort of that high arousal period, is just kind of the last leading trail of that amazing blissful experience, you know, and that it's going to fade too. And if they're not careful, it really can. So one of the things that I want to encourage you is that if you do notice that you can go to nonsymbolic.org and you can look at the publications page where there are more talks, mostly academic talks, frankly, that I've given, and some papers and some research summaries and stuff like that. And if, you know, when you're looking through there and you're getting a deeper understanding of these different locations on the continuum and whatnot, if when you're looking through there you're like, oh, okay, I got it. When you're experiencing that, even if it's just when you're experiencing it in a temporary way, if you can just sink into it, if you can just get yourself to soak into that, you know, whatever word feels most right for you, even if you've just experienced temporary glimpses of it, you can just sort of sink into that beingness, sink into that isness, sink into that presence, sink into however that's showing up for you. Just allow yourself to really sort of sink into it. You know, the neuroscientist in me essentially thinks of this as a battle of neurocircuits that are going on in your brain between a whole set of patterns and all of the neural connections that support those patterns that you fueled for years around the narrative self and emotionality and whatever else, to this other thing that for the first time, or maybe over time, whatever, most recent time, for the most recent time you've had a glimpse of. That glimpse is incredibly important because I think if you can just get yourself to sink into it and focus on it and not disregard it, as is so often the case by people who have a high arousal experience and then just assume that the peacefulness and the quiet head and all of that followed it is just something that's going to disappear just like the bliss disappeared. But if instead you can realize, oh no, that's the thing to sink into. You know, that's the state basically to try to make into something that's not a temporary state, but that's something more persistent. From my perspective, and it's not a spiritual perspective, it's not a religious perspective certainly, and it could be completely wrong. I don't have any claim on truth. But from my perspective, I think about things from the perspective of a psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, sort of brain scientist kind of way, right? And so I think of it as when you're sinking into that, you're flowing a lot more blood into those, you're really feeding those neural connections that don't often get a lot of food. Well, they don't get a lot of blood because most of the time you're in your head with the narrative self and all of that, right? So when you get that opportunity, when that moment presents itself, I think almost nothing is as important as sinking into it. And that's something that we've been able to experiment now, thanks to these, you know, these course experiments that we've been running. And so we've taken it from sort of anecdotal reports and things that we picked up during all those years of research to something that we've actually been able to see firsthand. and experiment with firsthand. And so that's, I would say, another sort of best practice that emerges from that. So my big advice to you is really don't look for this to be like this high arousal, amazing, blissful experience. Maybe it will be. Maybe you'll land on that part of the continuum, and maybe that'll be your experience of it forever. And more power to you. That's great. I don't personally have a belief that one part of the continuum is better than another part. I don't think one experience of this is better than another experience. I don't think there's more developed and less developed or any of that kind of thing. To me, it all eliminates a tremendous amount of suffering. It brings different perspective with it at different points in the continuum, and those different perspectives I think are useful for some are useful for some things and some are useful for other things. And I have sort of a tool kind of mentality associated with these different continuum locations. Certainly not a hierarchy, which is why they're not called levels. That's why we specifically call them locations, because we really don't make any judgments. We don't think people should make any judgments about one being higher than another. That's not to say if you're spiritual, you're religious, and you can clearly identify 2, and you can clearly identify location 3, and your spiritual tradition says location 3 is better. Well, that's great, but that's great for you within your context. And I don't invalidate that either. So this is our perspective on these different locations, and I just want to put that in your head so that you'll realize that if you're not, it's not like an ongoing bliss experience sort of forever kind of thing, unless you sort of land and stick in this one spot of the continuum. It shows up in a lot of different ways, and you don't want to miss it just because for certain people it shows up with that sort of trumpets and horns sort of effect, right, with that bliss and all of that. And then when that trails off, the effect that's left is definitely something that you can sink into and use. Okay, so those are points 1, 2, and 3. Let me see. That's our 4th point here. Different types of PNSE and best practices to use to deepen and move into them to optimize your experience of non-duality. That's a really good point. Let me give you some of these. So I would say that most people that I talk to are like, I want to be in location 3. There's that description of location 3. It just sounds so rich, and that's really where I want to be. There are in the course, in the experiment, there are a few methods that have seemed quite reliable in shifting people to location 3. So let's talk about those. And the nice thing about talking about shifting to location 3 is that if you identify your experience as location 1 or 2, you can use these to sort of move you through to location 3, right? If you don't want to get to location 3, if you just want to deepen in location 1, these can often be useful for that as well. If you pull you through 2, you want to stop at 2, fine, stop doing them. But they seem to be able to sort of produce some movement in that direction, shall we say. So one of them is a mantra-based technique that you can search all of these on Google or whatever. One of these is a mantra-based technique, and it's called ascension. It's a derivative of transcendental meditation, as far as we've been able to tell, except that it's in English, and it has lots and lots of different phrases that are repeated. The core instruction seems quite similar, and in fact, the person was a longtime TM teacher that developed it. So ascension is one of those things that seems to really very powerfully move people in the direction and kind of just root them in to location 3. Another thing that moves people towards location 3 is probably a method that you've never heard of. You've no doubt heard of TM or transcendental meditation or mantra meditation or whatever. But there's almost a philosophy called actualism. So the idea behind actualism is that it's essentially about shifting yourself and getting yourself to produce a more direct experience of the world. They call it a pure conscious experience. They have something else they call an excellent experience, which is just like a pure consciousness experience, with one big difference: it doesn't bring the sense of safety with it. So you can sort of tell whether you're just having a great, wow, you're really into it, you're really into the moment and all of that, and the colors are great and all of that experience. Whether that's an excellent or a pure conscious experience in their world relates to that sense of safety and whether or not it has that sense of safety that arrives with it. So you can look up actualism online. It's out of Australia. If you search up actualism in Australia, you'll come up with it. If you search by the Another name for that system, the system itself, is actual freedom. Let me give you a little bit of a caution about this one, though. Actual freedom seems to be one of those things that is most effective for people who are already either having temporary experiences or who are shifted into some continuum location. Right? So I've heard it over the years reported with tremendous amounts of success to move people who were at the end of 2, for instance, deep in location 2 or deep in location 3 or whatever, further. And let me say a little bit about that, because actually their location 3, to them, location 3 is like a preliminary stop-off that you don't want to stay at very long and that you want to move on to location 4. So the other interesting thing about this method is that it's the only method that I know of that seems to have been remarkably reliable to move people who are already on the continuum somewhere, non-dual, persistent, non-symbolic experience, whatever. That somebody was already across the line, if you will. Somebody was already there. Pull them into 3 and into 4 and into location 4. I don't know of anything else that is that reliable, that is as reliable as this method of pulling people into location 4. But you can get off the ride at location 3, so it also makes it a really handy thing to pull you to location 3. So if you're someone who's had temporary experiences, especially more recent temporary experiences, not something that was like in childhood or something like that, if you've had a reasonably recent experience, this is definitely something that might be a match for you. Just real quick, some of the other methods that are associated with this. Actually, the traditional sort of direct inquiry path of non-duality is a very, very, very powerful one. Some of the trends that we see around it are really quite interesting. It seems incredibly effective for people who have been trying very hard to get to non-duality or persistent non-symbolic experience for years, for a long time. Like, they've tried a ton of stuff, right? And they're almost to the point where they're just like throwing up their arms and being like, I give. I can't possibly do another thing. None of this stuff's ever going to work for me. And then somehow they stumble on direct inquiry, the sort of what I would call neo-Advaita type stuff, and boom, they like cross over quick. So it's really interesting. It seems like a lot of seeking, if you will, a lot of really hardcore trying for it, aligns you really, really well with those practices, and that you're just ready to pop. And that method seems to, those types of methods seem to really sort of get you there. They seem to really sort of help you pop. Okay, let me look at the time. Yep. So that's, I think, where we'll leave our 4 main points so that we could at least get to some of your questions here. And I think probably what we'll do is we'll send out a maybe we'll send out an email with some more information about some of that. We'll remind you of some of those links. We're recording this, so you can watch it back later as well. So you don't have to, be furiously writing everything down or exploring websites or whatever while you're listening. Okay, so let me switch over to my chat window here. And somebody has been very kindly sort of curating questions that came in throughout this, so I'm going to take a look at one of them here. Why would a minister want location number 4A, or 4 plus maybe? Well, that's a good question. If you read Bernadette Roberts' stuff, I think she does a very good job of contextualizing this from a Christian perspective. She really struggled with where does Jesus and the Holy Spirit, where does the Holy Spirit, all of that fit in. And certainly she finds it to be extremely important to her own personal Christian path. By minister, I'm assuming it's Christian minister. It's not saying rabbi or imam or something like that. So that's why I'm making that assumption. Each further location does bring with it increased well-being and an increased sense of freedom. They all sort of bring their own notion of what truth is, and they can be conflicting in those notions. But it's not hard to understand why someone would want to move further, and why it would be okay to move further, even though there's a sense of the divine that passes. Bernadette has done a really good job, for instance, of recontextualizing how God shows up and what God really might be, and who Jesus really might be in that type of a situation, and things like that. So she certainly didn't lose her faith; it only strengthened her faith. And so I could see it being useful from a ministry standpoint. Now let me say a little bit more about that, actually, because people in location 4 often don't have necessarily the best social graces. So if you were an active minister of a church, maybe location 2, location 3, a good sweet spot for you. You still got a lot of well-being, you're still feeling great, doing great, but your social graces are still very much intact, which isn't necessarily always the case with someone in location 4. So I'll add that from an occupational standpoint. Let's see, let me pick another one here. We got just tons of them pouring in. It's kind of hard to, they need to give me the ability to freeze this window. The concept of persistent non-symbolic experiencing seems to Vedanta's singularity of moksha. I don't actually, let me broaden that question out a little bit, and let me talk about it in relation to different traditions. I think one of the things that you see a lot in every tradition is a lot of disagreement. It doesn't matter if it's the non-dual world, or if it's Christianity, or if it's Vedanta, or whatever. Tibetan Buddhists, whoever. There seems to always be a certain amount of disagreement among even the most accomplished people. That's not hard for us to understand, because we've sat down with so many of them, and just frankly so many of them are in my life and whatnot at this point. Although the cognitive structures underneath location 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, are the same, very similar. If you're in location 4, what I mean by that is if you're in location 4, for instance, you have sort of the same underlying cognitive structures. Imagine this. Imagine if you're in some sort of religion, and maybe it is a Vedanta type, some stream of Advaita Vedanta or something like that. Probably there aren't that many of the realized teachers who are in location 4. Right? Some are going to be in location 3, some are going to be in location 2. Their experience is going to, mostly match with how they're interpreting the texts. It's going to all make sense to them. And it's, I think, very easy to see how they can have conflict and disagreement with each other. So I'm not a religious scholar, right? I mean, I'm just somebody who sat down with a whole lot of these people and cataloged this from a psychological, cognitive science, neuroscience type perspective. But in that process, it became super obvious to me, especially because I would sit down with people who just, from the same tradition, who just vehemently disagreed with each other. And I would, from the outside, be like, well, you guys are like working off the same books, you're working off the same ideologies, and how can you be so totally at odds in terms of your opinion of what you think the end state of your faith tradition or spiritual tradition or whatever is. And over the years, as the continuum unfolded and as we got enough data to group it, and as that whole thing sort of emerged, it became increasingly clear. These people were just at two different spots. You had somebody from location 4, debating in their tradition with somebody from location 2. And how that shows up prospectively is very, very different. And yet each one of those people are in a place where they feel like they are, without a doubt, experiencing truth. There is a tremendous sense of certainty that accompanies this, regardless of where you land. So each one of them is very certain about their position and their perspective. And in our research, it seems like the thing that really shifts people out of that certainty is when they shift to another location on the continuum. Most people don't shift. Most people land in a spot on the continuum, they deepen in that spot on the continuum. But some people do shift, and the people that do shift, they will often, they'll realize, well, geez, a minute ago, that other thing felt completely certain. Now this feels completely certain. Right? I mean, there's just like, they have to come to grips with it somehow. So I think a lot of it sort of comes from that type of difference in the underlying architecture, which it's all close enough. This stuff is all, you know, in the ballpark where you can read the text and it seems to apply to you, even though you have these underlying differences. So yeah, that's been one of those things that's been interesting for us to see for a long time. Let's see. There's lots of questions about the course and stuff, but let me get to something that's like meaty. Are you assuming that people know? Nope, the 4 methods are earlier. I did a review of those earlier briefly, and you can find them at nonsymbolic.org on the publications page. There's a summary for the public. Let's see what else we have here. All right. There's a lot of questions about the course. Is a teacher needed for a method that matches oneself? Great question. That's a great question. The idea of teachers. To what degree does a teacher really impact you? And I think another kind of often what people are really asking along these lines is not necessarily do I need a skilled teacher, but can this stuff rub off on me? Right? If I'm like around somebody who has persistent non-symbolic experience, you know, and I'm like rubbing against them, you know, 15 minutes a day, or, you know, I'm in the same room and their voice is just bouncing off of my skin, you know, I just vibrate right up to their level or whatever. That is, I think, a really fascinating question. So both of these things are fascinating, and I'll tackle both of them real quick. First of all, there doesn't seem to be a suggestion in the data that being around someone who experiences persistent non-symbolic experience gets you there. And the biggest example of this is people's families. So, you know, you have somebody there living with you 24 hours a day. It's your wife or husband and your children and maybe one of your, you know, parents or something. And they're clearly not non-dual, right? So that's one very obvious way of saying that, well, that nobody's around you more than your family, right? Or maybe your coworkers. Same thing is true with coworkers. So there doesn't seem to sort of be this just field effect that impacts everyone, and it's just, you know, if you just soak in it for 3-4 days around somebody, you know, that's the magic. Doesn't work that way. However, if you were a dear friend of mine and you were saying to, okay, Jeffrey, but really, should I go, and, you know, should I go see out Ashanti, or, you know, should I get around some of these people? My advice to you would be, sure, absolutely, meet as many of them as you can, because there are some effects that seem to be anecdotally supported in the data around this. So even though their families don't necessarily wake up, there does seem to be a resonance that some people experience. And I think this is one of the really neat things about, for instance, a conference like SAN, the Science of Non-Duality Conference, which was a couple of weekends ago out here in the Bay Area, visiting actually for that conference as I make this. That's a really fantastic service that Mauricio and Zaya put together, where you have this incredible opportunity to get exposed to a whole bunch of people who are non-dual. And so maybe it's just language patterns that might resonate and make a difference, or maybe there is some sort of field effect that for some people has an effect that we just haven't uncovered yet, or who knows. But for some people, there is definitely an impact of just interaction, just being in a crowd, just hearing, you know, someone speak, not even a one-to-one interaction. Okay, so having said that, the other side of the question is, what about teacher skill? Well, teacher skill is all over the place. And there's a whole lot of teachers who have very low effects, just don't seem to have a lot of impact. And there's teachers out there who, you know, rarely seem to miss, and everything in between. So when you find a method that works for you, I think it's the best idea in the world to find a skillful teacher. You know, why wouldn't you really want to do that? Because they can really help you. And that's one of the things that we've thought a lot about with the Finders course experiment, is that we sort of have this sorting thing, right? I mean, you know, you come into it, you learn what works for you, maybe you wake up in it, maybe you don't wake up in it, maybe you don't wake up until some point after it, whatever. But chances are, regardless of whether you woke up or didn't wake up, you're going to be seeking more information, right? And that information should come from skilled sources. Now, maybe you're in a situation where you absolutely know something that's working for you, and that's great. I would absolutely encourage you, try to find the best possible teachers you can. Doesn't even have to be, not one teacher. You could use a bunch of teachers, use 2 or 3 teachers, whatever. If you can only find, and there's one teacher that's really great for you, and that method, that thing that's working for you, great, use them. So yeah, I'm a huge believer in skilled instruction and in having somebody that can really sort of guide you as you move further. Now, let me give you a caveat to that. Having been an over-the-top advocate, the caveat that I would give you to that is that this information about the continuum is not widely distributed. It's distributed if you study this stuff in the academy, if you're a scientist in this area. But it's not distributed if you're in the public. And so, let me give you an example story. There was someone who was very familiar with all kinds of location 1, 2, 3, and this person for years. And this person had a transition to location 4. And one of the very first things that this person did was they went and they sought the advice, which is totally different, right? Very different than what came before it. They were like, whoa, something's happened. Right? So the first thing that they did was they went and they sought the advice of their spiritual teacher. And this spiritual teacher is an incredibly skilled and highly capable teacher. Just a very, very talented teacher. But this teacher had no frame of reference for location 4. And so this teacher is all about, love is the end state, kind of location 3, like as deep as you can go in location 3, that's sort of the end state, and that's as far as you can go and all that. That's the right place to be. It's sort of that ideology. So, along comes her student, and the student says to her, well, I don't have any love, and, whatever else. And it's just like screeching halt in this teacher's head. It's just, what? No! Something's gone terribly wrong kind of thing, right? And so she basically conveyed, listen, what are you hiding from? You're blocking your emotions, you're hiding from something, what is it that you're hiding from? And it had a significant impact on this person. This person really trusted this teacher. This teacher had a profound effect on their life. And they wound up pulling themselves back. This person wound up pulling themselves back from location 4, back to an earlier location on the continuum, eventually around location 2. And so you do have to be a little bit careful from a teacher standpoint, because they will absolutely have their ideas about what's right or wrong, and this information about these different locations and whatnot, it's not really widely out there right now. So if you do have an experience that sounds like location 4, and your teacher is saying to you, well, what about love? I think that's okay, but I would not necessarily even stop working with that teacher, but I would find another teacher who gets the other side of that. And there are certainly public people out there who do teach people, and who are in location 4, beyond location 4, understand that transition, etc., know how to contextualize it, sink it in, all that. Okay, so that's what I would say about teachers. That was a fantastic question. Let's see. Oh, do people report loneliness? This is a super cool thing. In each of the measures that we do over time, right? We're constantly rotating new measures in and out. Well, one of the measures for this last Finders course experiment that we were running had a dimension of loneliness, and it showed that a certain percentage of people were pretty to very lonely before the class, and at the second measurement point, halfway through, those loneliness scores were essentially obliterated. And I thought, man, that's really cool. I hadn't really thought of testing for that. It was kind of a tag along. I was going for something else in that particular measure. I was wanting another dimension of that measure. But that was a really neat finding, I thought. So I'm curious to see now as we go further to the final measurement period in a couple of weeks or whatever, what that turns out to be. I suspect that it will continue to be in that same direction, because the way loneliness traditionally shows up, I don't expect it to be showing up in the population. However, it is in some sense sort of an isolating thing. And there are many people who experience this who really can't tell their spouse, feel like they can't tell their spouse, feel like they can't talk about it with anyone really in their life. And this was a surprise to us. when this first started to turn up in the data. When those first people decided, I don't want to meet you in my living room. I've never told my family anything about this. Let's meet at Starbucks or whatever. Some people would want to meet in a library because for some people this happens and they don't have any spiritual or religious framing for it, and they have no idea what happened to them. They're worried that they went crazy, and they go see psychologists or psychiatrists, and the psychiatrists are like, well, you have really high well-being. For us, pathology is people who are miserable, so we don't necessarily have anything that matches you. And oftentimes people had stumbled into this. People have been in this for a long time. So pre-internet days, they would stumble into the library, and there would be this extremely important shelf in the library that dealt with this type of thing that they would want to show me as part of the research, as part of the interview process. They would want the interview to start at that shelf that really showed them they weren't crazy, that there were all these other people that experienced it. So it does have an isolating impact. If you're not in a community that gets it, and let's face it, most of the mainstream religions really push this to the margin. Probably if you're in a mainstream church, your pastor doesn't necessarily want to hear about it, and in fact, there's an interesting phenomenon around that in developed countries, especially in America. Almost every large city, there's at least one storefront church, or a church that's kind of renting out a theater, a small theater, or something like that, where people who have had persistent non-symbolic experience meet that are still Christian. So that doesn't mean they don't go to their normal church. They still go to their normal church most times. But they also have found this other sort of safe place where they can talk about what's really going on with them. So they kind of have, one form of support coming from their normal church, and then a second form of support coming from this type of thing. So it can be very isolating for people, for sure. But loneliness is not necessarily, I don't think, a relevant thing. Let's see. What else here? What's more about the course? This is the second question. Just being free of narrative thoughts and chatter would be well worth the effort. Can one do the daily work and stay within a certain location? Then they go on to say, I would want an experience of the divine. I don't know how to shape the experience in terms of whether it shows up as divine or not. It seems to relate to previous ideology, previous belief system, things like that. And the context for how it occurs. Someone can be, for instance, an atheist and just randomly be at church for a wedding or something and have this powerful experience, and then suddenly they're like a diehard supporter of that religion. I've had those types of reports. So there's context that matters, belief system, ideology, it all seems to play into it. There's a lot of people, especially in the non-dual community, who were religious in some way, or at least lightly religious, moderately religious, prior to their awakening, who had that just totally go away for them. It was really common in the non-dual community for people to report themselves as no longer religious, even if they were very religious prior to its onset. So being thought-free and chatter, I think the question is essentially, can you just go through life with an empty head, right? Because for most people that probably seems pretty impossible, right? I think there's this sense that this is extraordinarily valuable, this voice that's constantly chattering away in our heads. And for a lot of our life, I think it is. It's been very, very useful over time. It's wormed its way into the position it has, not because it was maladaptive so much as because it has, some degree of utility, a great degree of utility. But the absolute answer to that is yes. Certainly you can, or it's reported to us in spades, and including all kinds of work. Right? This question is specifically about work. There's a very small percentage. There's a certain percentage of people who woke up before work. They would get up and they would do meditation or whatever before they went to work, and just one day, bing, it happens, right? And they're thinking to themselves, holy cow, how in the world am I going to get through the workday? I can't work like this. I can't go, my head is empty. I can't think. Holy cow, I'm in trouble, right? But I got to go to work. So they, get dressed, get in the car, go to work. As they're driving home from work, later that night, they think to themselves, wow, that wasn't a problem at all, right? Like nobody seemed to really notice. Nobody was like, hey, where did Jane go? Or what happened to Jane? But you seemed to Jane. Did you seem to avoid Jane today? Right? None of that. Essentially, they just discover that most of their life remains on autopilot. That there's a whole lot of conditioning and whatnot that's been built up, and the body and mind and all that seems to know what to do, and it just keeps doing it. If anything, it's a lot more effective. You know, it's a lot. There's a mental clarity. It's not all the distraction. It's not being clouded by all sorts of emotional things around approval and stuff like that. So yeah, that's a huge surprise in those people's lives. I think that's a great way of really framing it through their perspective. And listen, some of those people had some really tough jobs. I mean, hardcore engineering jobs. Jobs as senior executives with ridiculous amounts of pressure, huge budgets, tons of people working for them at some level down below, all the way on down to, you know, people who had service level jobs, who worked at restaurants, you name it. There was one fellow who was a high school maintenance type guy. And all of them, you know, wasn't a problem basically across any of that range of work. I've never had anybody come to me and say, whew, wow, you know, this is great, but I miss my career because I just couldn't do it after this. Doesn't happen. Of course, people do leave their careers. Some people do make life changes. But even that is not necessarily that common. It's common among spiritual teachers because they were something before they were a spiritual teacher. So I think people assume it's really common that, you know, you're going to have this experience and then you're just going to, everything is going to change in your life and you're going to go do something else. But most of our population were just normal people, normal jobs, you know, out there doing their thing, raising their families, all that. And for them, it was an absolute net plus. All right, that was a great question. Let's see. Let me look for some other ones here. Okay, we've answered some of these. Oh, yeah, okay. This is another, yeah, this is a good one. And it's some teachers who seem to be in a state that is, some teachers seem to be in a state that is cut off from their emotional problems, and eventually it comes out in, quote, unsavory actions, unquote. So, you know, we've all heard the stories of the spiritual guru who was sleeping with his devotees' wives or whatever it is, right? There's actually lots of websites and stuff that document this kind of stuff, talk about it, there's books about it. Not hard to find this stuff. I think that's a really good question. And one of the things where there's perhaps a disconnect in expectation between what people expect from our research findings and what they hear from our research findings are around things like morality. This often doesn't produce some sort of significant shift in a person's morality. It does produce a very fundamental shift, you know, tremendous well-being, all of that. Can make them more effective, all the things that we've talked about. But it doesn't necessarily have a powerful impact on morality. And so if you have someone who was kind of a not so ethical advertising person or something before this, they're kind of a not so ethical advertising person after this. And that's just, you know, that's what it is. I think this has been dealt with in a lot of different religious and spiritual systems by trying to cultivate it independently before someone transitions to persistent non-symbolic experience, really trying to get some compassion rooted in, that type of thing. There's a lot of complexity in this area that we can talk about, but just, you know, a lot of fundamental things don't change, right? I mean, if they liked shrimp the day before, they still like shrimp. You know, they don't completely burn their wardrobe and then go out and buy white robes or something. I mean, they still dress the same, talk the same, act the same. People around them may have no idea that they've even been through this transition, unless they were, like, you know, really depressed or something before. Obviously, then everybody notices. But people outwardly remain relatively unchanged, and that includes things like their morality and how that morality translates into their actions in the world. So I know there's been a lot I can just tell that there's a lot of information out there, that there's a lot of expectation out there that, well, somebody who's really, achieved these high and lofty states, they would never be, whatever, engaged in some nasty political battle, or, they wouldn't be a cheat, or they wouldn't be a whatever. But our data suggests that all of that's in there. And frankly, if you look at, there's a lot of very, very realized people, especially in some of the Eastern traditions, and yet, those organizations are unlike any. They're just like every other organization, that they're just political minefields. There's all these sects and factions and infighting and wars raging back and forth. And it's not that the people that are doing that are unrealized. It's just that, lots of things remain the same. So I would say, that's definitely a mismatch, and that's an interesting mismatch between public perception of what this is and actual reality, shall we say. There's a lot of spiritual salesmanship stuff like that we've encountered in people's expectations, like synchronicities and manifestations, and well, the world would just, open a golden path for you, right, when this happens, and you'll never have any problems, and so there's clearly a lot of folks out there, or at least some folks out there, saying stuff like that, sort of putting these expectations out there. But people still have problems. I mean, they go to jail, their spouse goes to jail, they go bankrupt, they have health problems. I mean, this is not a panacea for reality, like people seem to sometimes expect it to be. However, how reality shows up for you, how you deal with reality, how your perception of reality unfolds, things like that. I mean, you definitely want to be, on the PNSE side of the fence. If something's going down, right, if you are going to go bankrupt, heck of a lot better to be going bankrupt from this side of the fence than the other side of the fence. And you can see a little bit of that, actually, if you look at one of the interviews that we did for the first participants in the Finder's Course experiment was a gentleman named Paul Buxton, who's just an absolutely lovely, amazing human being. And the whole time he was going through the course, his life was rough. He was in a really, really rough spot. And he talks about that on the interviews. So if you go to the Finder's Course YouTube channel and you look at his interview, there's short ones and little ones and long ones. Some of them have been edited down, but the whole one is there too. You can watch the whole thing if you want. You'll really sort of see just the remarkable difference that it makes during those rough spots in life. I think listen, it's great, the rest of the time, but it's also really, really nice during those times. Let's do one more here, maybe. Let's see. I wish this type was bigger. I don't mean to be squinting so tight at the screen here. It's tiny, tiny little print. This is a good one. Does transitioning into PNSE or a higher level thereof tend to increase the person's effectiveness? In what ways? Can you give an example or two? We talked a little bit about that, but I think that's something that bears a little bit more fleshing out, because I think a lot of people have fear of this. One of the surprising things from my perspective is that the very best, sort of most reliable teachers out there, when they encounter even serious students, sometimes those students are just like, whoa, gotta go, right? I mean, all this time they think they wanted it, right? But when it's clear that it could actually get there, that they could actually get there, that they could actually be presented with it or whatever, they're like, gotta go. So a lot of it, I think, relates to it's the fact that it's this narrative sense of self, it's this individualized sense of self that is the thing that wants it, but it's also the thing that goes away, right? In big pieces, large, small pieces. I mean, there's all sorts of complexity to that sort of Houdini act, but it does in fact, not necessarily get to participate in the fruits of that transition. And so it has a tremendous amount of sway, it seems, over action. And one of the things that it can produce is fear as someone gets closer to this. And if you think about the way this has been presented, I don't think that that's very surprising, because it's often referred to as, there's no you anymore, you're just totally gone, you just go away, everything is different, whatever. Those are things that are terrifying for the individualized sense of self or narrative sense of self. It's tried awfully hard for a really long time to not die, right? And in all of those statements, basically what it's hearing is, yeah, you're going to die. You're going to go. So it's not surprising that it has that resistance, and it offers up a tremendous amount of fear and a tremendous amount of resistance. And one of the data points around this is that just prior to transition, some people have an instantaneous transition, some people phase into it. It's our data, which isn't representative. We don't have we didn't do population type data where we just do a random sample of everyone, and so we can't compute sort of population statistics and percentages. We were trying to get a different type of sampling where people were very meaningfully represented, where a lot of where basically many versions, if not every version of this that we could find, was very well represented. So in our data, about 70% of people woke up in a moment, and 30% of people transitioned to it over the course of a couple of weeks or months or whatever. So, so of the people who woke up instantly, it was really, really common to hear reports of tremendous, just gripping fear occurring just prior to the transition. And then a moment later, just the skies part and it's all different. So, that type of thing, that type of report of fear and all of that is very common. Now, I hope to have given you enough feedback to know that you're basically still you, right? I mean, if your wife and kids think you're still you, or your husband and kids think you're still you, basically, right? From an outward world, right? So when people talk about this huge amount of difference, and there's no me anymore, I'm completely gone, and all of that, I think it can be viewed in a much softer sort of way that can reduce some of the fear involved in that transition. Because if you go to San, for instance, and you just start hanging out with some people who experienced this, I mean, I don't know about you, but to me they seem like pretty normal people. Some people are grumpy, some people are super sweet and nice and lovey. I mean, it's all over the place. So they're really, to me, just very much still ordinary, normal people. I don't think there's anything to fear from this transition or to fear from this process. But I certainly understand why people do. So a couple of other benefits, aside from the clear thinking benefit, which is cited a lot, also, really, frankly, the emotional benefits can be huge. For instance, I'm sitting out here in San Francisco, and in San Francisco I deal with a lot of people from the tech world. And so one thing that I've noticed is that from a technology standpoint, there are, for instance, some just remarkably brilliant engineers out here. And not long ago, I was having a conversation with one of these engineers who experiences persistent non-symbolic experience, and he was saying to me, location 3 is where it's at if you're me, if you have my kind of job. Because every day you're going in, and it's like having sandpaper rubbed on your face for 10 or 12 or 14 or 16 straight hours while you're trying to solve what seem to the rest of the world to be literally impossible problems. And you know that you've got a year to do it. And what comes along with location 3, boy, that's just the sweet spot that gets you through. I mean, you can be just so much more productive doing this day in and day out in location 3 than anywhere else. And this is someone who has experienced the other locations on the continuum. And so they also think of it as kind of a Swiss Army sort of knife, where location 4 can be good for some things, location 2 can be good for some things. And so I think it really can be that practical, interestingly. Now, there's another side to this. Aside from what makes it better, there are also some landmines, right? If you wake up in location 4, your wife or husband does not take well to you telling them that you don't love them. Right? I mean, in any sort of relationship, there's kind of this exchange, and one of the fundamental exchanges in a deep interpersonal relationship is love, right? You expect to get love, if nothing else, even if it's tough love, you expect to get love from your partner. And in this case, I mean, it's just not there to give. So people who are honest about that with their spouse and who have a conversation with their spouse about that can really freak their spouse out. And it's not uncommon for that to be something that the spouse can't live with, that, you know, can break up the relationship and things like that. So there's, you know, there's tremendous pluses, there's tremendous minuses. There's this is a thing that sort of has to be practically navigated in the world, just like any other form of consciousness or whatever else. Okay, I think we've been going for a good long time now. We've gone quite a bit over what I was originally planning for here, but I really wanted to get some questions in, and I didn't want to just give short, you know, sort of not that informative answers. We're all about, like, you know, disseminating this stuff. So there were a lot of questions that I skipped over. There's just like a ton. I don't know if you guys can see the chat window or not, but if you can see the chat window, then you're probably seeing as many as I am. There's just like tons of questions about the course and things like that. There is actually another course. It starts on November 15th, so the timing is extremely tight for it. And it's the thing is, we don't just like let people into this. We have a certain number of seats, and we curate it a little bit. So, like, we try to, for instance, like, not have, you know, we're in small groups of 6, like I said earlier, right? So it sort of is crappy if you're in, like, New Zealand and your other small group members are in Iowa, right? Things like that. So we try to pay attention to things like location. We try to get a range of ages. We screen out severe psychological issues, things like that. So anyway, there is a curation process. It's not just like, oh, there's this unlimited number of things and everybody's welcome kind of thing. We're in the 3rd and final round, to be honest, with the Finder's Course 3 right now. So there's not a ton of spots left. But you can go to finderscourse.com, and I tell you, I think personally you should probably go to finderscourse.com because there's a good video. If you're really interested in this and you want to learn a little bit more about it, and especially you're interested in those sort of 2 key points of how to get there kind of thing, there's some good information, I think, in that video. One of the great things about that process is that it gives us the opportunity to do a little bit of education. So you don't just sort of come and find, oh yeah, here's the form to fill out for the course and all of that, right? I mean, we know that many people will come and they'll watch some videos and they'll absorb some information, and so we really just kind of try to tilt it so that there's good stuff there. And it's also an easy place to find, like, the interviews. We feature the interviews, and it's a kind of a convenient public outreach place for us. I don't know when the next one will run. The next one will run sometime in 2015, assuming we do run another one. It is very time consuming for us. So it's not, certainly there's no guarantee. We've done many things where we thought we'd just keep running them and then just didn't. So there's no guarantee that there will be a Finder's Course, another continuation of that experiment after the new year. So if you are interested, probably you should take your chances for one of those remaining seats. Don't rush there now. Don't stop listening to the webinar. It is curated. It's not first come, first serve, which should tell you that on the application form, what you write about yourself, really important, right? I mean, there's always like this certain percentage of people that get to the form and there's this box saying, hey, you know, who are you and why do you want to be in this and whatever else. And even though it says this is really important, like this is what we pay attention to in addition to the age question and the location question and all that, people will be like, oh, you know, I've been in non-duality for years and I just think it'll be a really interesting course. And that's all they tell us. I'm like, well, guess who doesn't get in, right? So if you are serious, it's not like a first come, first serve thing for these remaining seats. I mean, we're basically, sometime in the next day or two or whatever, we're going to be sifting through applications, sifting through the remaining applications, and we're basically going to decide on who gets the seats for the third and final round. So you're not behind and you're not ahead, and there's no reason to jump off, and not listen to the rest of this webinar. One thing that I saw a question there. It's worth talking a little bit about. The Finder's course, I said, is 15 weeks, and somebody picked up on that and were like, hey, wait a minute, how come you can have 6 methods in 15 weeks? And you said you only do 1 method a week. And that's a really good question. So a couple of the methods, and you should be aware of this, you should be careful of this. And in fact, the mantra-based methods are one of them. So you should be aware of it with the mantra-based type of methods. They're one of the 2 methods that this is prevalent for. Some of these methods, in a small percentage of people, produce very strong adverse emotional reactions. These are, in sort of the popular parlance, referred to as dark nights, or dark night of the soul type experiences. There's a fantastic researcher at Brown named Willoughby Britton who's been looking into these in recent years and really, doing some of the first and most important work on them. So because a couple of techniques sorted to the top that we knew from our data collection with all of the folks who were experiencing persistent non-symbolic experiences that had to use those techniques, we knew that there was a certain percentage of people that those had a profound and lasting negative emotional impact on. And by that I mean it could last days, weeks, months, years, decades. So it can really have a powerful impact. We spent some time basically last year, as you might imagine, trying to figure out what could be done to mitigate that. And one of the things that we learned was that just increasing people's well-being, traditional psychological well-being, seems to play a significant role in this. And so if you think about it this way, for many, many years, let's say that you were a meditation teacher for decades. You've been a meditation teacher for decades, and maybe you're a mantra-based meditation teacher. So you're a mantra-based meditation teacher who's been doing it for decades. People for decades have been coming to you, and these are not, generally speaking, happy people, right? In order to get to the point where you find the teacher who's like, oh yeah, it's all about losing yourself, you go away, right? You've got to be in a certain psychological, you've got to have a certain amount of psychological distress for that to sound like a good value proposition to you. Like, all right, finally I get rid of myself, right? So for a long time, you basically had this experience for these meditation teachers of lots of unhappy people coming to them. And there seemed to be sort of a impact on that in terms of dark nights. And then in recent years, you have Wall Street Journal articles talking about how if you just do, a mantra-based meditation like TM or Herb Benson's method or whatever, that, it'll clear your mind and you'll finally be able to vanquish all of your enemies in the boardroom, right, or whatever, right? And so this whole other group of people start coming to you to learn meditation, and these people aren't unhappy, right? They kind of got the world by the tail. And so for whatever reason, you're going along and you're kind of checking off the boxes. Okay, yep, there's stage 1, great, good job. Stage 1 checked off. Oh, yep, there's stage 2, good, stage 2 checked off, right? Stage 3 should be a dark night, right? But wait a minute, that's stage 4. Yeah, whoa, can't be stage 4. Wait a minute, there was no dark night after. Hold on, what's going on here, right? And so it turns out that there seem to have just kind of been these expectations in many ways, and some of these traditions and methods and practices or whatever, that these dark nights are just kind of essential and built in. But it kind of sort of seems like it was related a lot to the people who were coming to them for a long time. And so we experimented with that quite a bit to see if raising traditional psychological well-being before doing those techniques had an impact on, either duration of dark nights or whether or not people even had them or whatever else. So that's one key thing. And if you were going to do something like, a mantra meditation, right? If you were going to go into something like TM or whatever else, where if you go online, you see people reporting this, you talk to Willoughby, you listen to Willoughby's podcasts she's done on great media like Buddhist Geeks and places like that. It's probably worth your time to buy a book by like Sonia Lyubomirsky on happiness, or maybe Tal Ben-Shahar on happiness, or Martin Seligman on happiness and well-being. Buy somebody who's got a manual on how to subjectively increase your happiness, and do that for a few weeks before you go into a technique that is sort of known for producing this in however small a percentage of people, because you don't want it to be you. So the answer to why it's not a 6-week thing and why it's a 15-week thing is because we put some time into figuring out what should go into mitigating that dark night issue. And the first part of the first 6 weeks that we tacked on, essentially, that's all about traditional psychological positive psychology techniques, basically the gold standard positive psychology techniques, trying to really sort of get everyone's well-being up to a point where we can even let you take the second half of the course. If your well-being isn't at a point, we haven't had this problem. We haven't had to kick anybody out because their well-being wasn't high enough by the second part of the course. But believe me, there have been some dramatic increases to get up to that benchmark level of well-being over the first part of that course using these types of techniques. And so I would really recommend and encourage you to think about doing that just in your own world, in your own personal practice, in your own whatever. Incidentally, the other thing that we think is very powerful in that regard is having a positive first experience of deeper and more fundamental awareness, or whatever we want to call it. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but there's a lot of near-death experiences, and I can remember, I don't know, in the early 90s or something, I was looking at this bookshelf, and there were all these books like, Into the Light, Embraced by the Light, whatever else. It was like the beginning of this being popular, this notion that all of these people were experiencing these amazing transformative near-death experiences or whatever. But there's also lots of research on the not-so-positive near-death experiences, the hell-like experiences and all of that. And of course you see the same thing with psychedelic users, where you have positive drug experiences and negative drug experiences, and I don't think it should surprise anybody that's interested in this that you can also have positive first glimpses of fundamental awareness and not so positive first glimpses of fundamental awareness. So that seems to be another thing to try to engineer around for yourself to avoid the dark night type phenomenon. In the course we use a practice that we call the group awareness practice, or the group awareness exercise. And you could really do this with friends if you wanted to. It's not very hard. It essentially involves you just all describing awareness. So you try to put your attention on awareness itself in the present moment, and you try to describe it. You start off maybe describing it for 15 minutes, and then maybe go to 15 seconds, and then go to 30 seconds, and then maybe go to 45 seconds, and then maybe go to a minute. And what you find, it takes some time. It's not a short practice. It's a 90-minute to 3-hour practice. And over time, it does wind you down into it. And it can provide that important sort of first glimpse, if you will. And the nice thing about it, the reason we selected it, is because it provides it in a very safe setting, right? Other people are describing it. They're either on your screen if you're doing it online over something like Google+, or they're in person with you if you're sitting around doing it. But they're clearly not going crazy, right? Like the rest of the group is clearly not going crazy. So there's much less proclivity for you to feel like, oh my God, am I going crazy? What's going on here, right? When you're alone and isolated and you have some of these first glimpses, if your mind takes it down a negative path instead of a more positive path, that can totally happen to you. So it provides a really powerful check. And actually, if you're interested in that, there's a really, really fantastic guy who developed that method that we used. You can look him up online. His name is Sperry Andrews, and he's another one of those just dear souls, just an amazing fellow. All right, I think I'm just going to do a quick scan here for our people that are on our staff to make sure that there isn't anything that they're like. Nope, I don't see anything critical and missing. So let me just tell you what an honor it is, really, to be sitting in front of you here tonight. I just really thank you for your interest. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for the trust, really, that you place in our research at this point. And I especially thank everyone on the call who has helped with the research, whether you're a researcher or someone who has been involved in the experiment. maybe contributing, key methods and expertise, or certainly, most of all, anyone who may be on the call who was a participant and who really did open their homes and their hearts to us. I just appreciate it so much. Love you guys all ladies, not just guys. Love you guys and gals, gentlemen and ladies, whatever, wherever you are. Thank you so much. We really look forward to, we hope that this gives back to you, and of course we're going to keep doing that. But I just really want to say thank you. So that's it. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.